Hey guys, it's Libby. I am back. I ended up taking the month of November off from BookTube. I had the flu at the beginning of the month. It was no fun and I didn't feel like doing anything. And then I was still a bit worn out after Victober. I think a lot of us were, so I just decided for November I will do other things, and I did, and it was lovely, but now I am back. I also got a new camera, so you should be seeing my face in glorious HD. Now you can become intimately acquainted with all of my pores. Also, the viewfinder of this camera is mirror image, unlike my last one. So my face looks really weird to me, but it should not affect your viewing experience. So in addition to being a weird video making month, November was also a weird reading month for me. I felt the urge to be reading several books at the same time. I think I was reading like 5 books at the same time. Our Mutual Friend, The Infernal World of Branwell Bronte, The Miniaturist, Game of Love and Chance, Murder on the Orient Express, and then some Shakespeare's. So I was moving through all of these quite slowly since I was only getting through, you know, a chapter or two every day. So at this point I'm quite close to finishing a number of books, but I haven't actually finished them because the last 3 days of the month I dropped all of them and just like very passionately and intensely read 3 other things. So the only stuff I can actually talk about in this video are those 3 things I read at the end of the month and then the couple of Shakespeare things that I got through. So the first thing that I finished was Cymbeline. This is one of William Shakespeare's late romances, along with The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, and Pericles. Personally, I think All's Well That Ends Well should also be classed as a late romance, but it's not, so we'll have that argument later. This is the last romance that I had to read. And because of its genre, it's quite different than all the other Shakespeare plays. You have to approach it not in a realistic way. This is much more like a fairy tale than like a historical story, even though it is based in history. So Cymbeline is set during the Roman conquest of Britain. Cymbeline is the king of Britain. And the opening scene is a little bit silly because 2 random lords who are not important to the rest of the play show up and give us an absurd amount of backstory. So we learned that the king is married to his second wife right now. With his first wife, he has a daughter named Imogen, and his second wife also has a son from a previous marriage named Cloten. And Imogen, as the princess, is going to inherit everything, but there's a little because she's a woman. So the plan that the king and queen have is that Imogen and Cloten will marry, and then they can rule together jointly since they're both members of the royal family. Unfortunately, Cloten is a total buffoon. He's violent, but he's bad at committing violence. He's just the worst in kind of all possible ways. But there is this other man named Posthumus Leontes who is an orphan, and he has been brought up by Cymbeline, and he is everything that Cloten is not. He is courtly and romantic and good at sword fighting and just all of the things you could possibly want in a man. And so Imogen and he have fallen in love, and they have gotten secretly married, and the king and queen and Cloten are furious. Also, by the way, Imogen isn't actually the king's only child. He has 2 sons who were stolen in infancy. This will surely not come up later in the play. So our 2 randos introduce us to the situation, and then we get to meet the players. The queen pretends to be very nice and helpful, but she's secretly evil. She hates Imogen, and she wants to like poison the king so that she can put Cloten on the throne. She breaks up Posthumus and Imogen, and she and the king force Posthumus into exile in Italy. They call it Italy. At this point, it's technically Rome. While Posthumus is there staying with a friend of his father's, he meets a man named Iachimo, and they have this sort of verbal contest about how virtuous Imogen is. Posthumus says, I have the most virtuous and perfect wife in all of the world, and even if you went there and tried to seduce her, you would not be able to. And Iachimo says, wanna bet? And Posthumus says, yes. I don't know why he does this. This is a terrible idea to make a bet with someone to go seduce your wife. Either he's going to successfully seduce her and then you will be really sad, or He's not going to successfully seduce her, and you've sent this man to sexually harass your wife. Posthumous? I thought you were our hero. So he sends Iachimo off to go do this, and then everything just sort of goes nuts from there. All of the usual Shakespearean romance things. Woman disguised as a man, mistaken identity, people who are dead but not really dead. And then in the end, everything is totally fine. Kind of unbelievably fine, if you ask me, but it's a romance! Now, I gave this 4 stars, like a higher 4 stars. I think this is my favorite of Shakespeare's romances. There are things that I can appreciate in The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, and I understood what happened in Pericles. It's about the best that I can say for it. And I kind of think everyone has like their own particular favorite of the romances. For a lot of people, I know it's The Tempest, but I think I'm a Cymbeline gal. That might just be because I haven't read the other ones in a while, and as I'm finishing out the complete works, I really find that the more Shakespeare plays you've read, the more you appreciate all of the other ones, because you can see connections between the plays and different characters in different plays. So you can sort of read Cymbeline as either a reverse King Lear or a King Lear where everything goes right. So yeah, this is a good one for people who've already read some Shakespeare's. Probably not a great place to start though, unless you are like a really big fan of fairy tales and you're very comfortable getting into that sort of world and that sort of frame of mind. The next 2 things that I read were some poems by Shakespeare, in addition to his plays and all of his sonnets. Shakespeare also wrote 3 narrative poems, one of which I read. It was The Lover's Complaint, and one lyric poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle. So The Lover's Complaint is not too long. It's, it's longer than I thought. Okay, it's 329 lines. And it is not that good. We get introduced to this sort of pastoral setting, and then we see a sobbing woman, and she tells us about how she was seduced. There's a long quotation of the speech that her lover used to seduce her, and she's like, and I believed him, and he didn't marry me. Woe is me. That's the poem. There aren't really any beautiful lines. Yeah, give this one a miss unless you're a completionist. And then The Phoenix and the Turtle is remarkably short, so there's almost nothing I can say about it. It's 2.5 pages in my Yale edition. It's basically using sort of the symbolism associated with different types of birds. It just sort of references those, and then laments about the how the phoenix and the turtle, turtle meaning turtle dove, not like turtle with a shell, although that would be funny, have been separated by death, and like how their love was so pure. And I think this would have read better in the 16th century. It's not really making references that I understand or appreciate. I did think it was better than The Lover's Complaint, so it has that. Also, you can read it in about 90 seconds, so. And then moving on to the last 3 days of the month when I put aside all of the books that I could have finished. So what happened was, on Twitter, I follow William Shakespeare, not actual William Shakespeare. It's just a bot that tweets, actually it may not be a bot, it may be a real human, that tweets random lines from Shakespeare. And sometimes I can recognize them. Sometimes I have to go look them up, and sometimes I just decide that I don't care. So I tweeted a line from Hamlet. It was, "Use them after your own honor and dignity. The less they deserve, the more merit is in your bounty. Take them in," which Hamlet says to Polonius regarding the actors. So I couldn't quite remember where that was from, so I Googled it, I looked it up, I found the scene that it was in, so I read that little section of the scene to get some context, and then I sort of found myself reading the entirety of that scene, and then I was like, screw it, I'm just gonna reread the play. So I read Hamlet for, I don't know, I'm surely in the double digits of number of times that I've read Hamlet. This is also the second time I've read it this year. I read it back in January. I try to avoid reading the same book twice in 1 year, but you know, guys, it's Hamlet. It's allowed to break rules. I'm sure that you do not need me to tell you what the most famous play in existence is about. I did have a different experience reading it this time than I normally do. What I've been trying to do with Hamlet the last couple of times I read it is strip back interpretations instead of adding more, because the first time anyone reads Hamlet, since it's such a big deal in our society, you go through already knowing what's going to happen, already looking for all of the weighty metaphors and ruminations on life and death, and you kind of are never able to read Hamlet freshly as the original audiences would. And so when I read Hamlet, I kind of try to forget everything that I know about it. I try to not realize that the ghost is the victim of a murder in the first scene, and you know, when I meet Hamlet the first time, I try to not think about him as doomed to die. And also this time when I read it, I cried. I had a sudden and intense eruption from my tear ducts. I've never cried reading Hamlet before. I have cried at the very end of the Ken Branagh film the second time I watched it. I've watched it 3 or 4 times. But yeah, it was kind of an odd place to cry. It was in Act 3, Scene 4, after the play within a play scene, in the big climactic scene between Hamlet and Gertrude. When the ghost comes in, he says, on him, look you, how pale he glares, his form and cause conjoined, preaching to stones would make them capable. Do not look upon me, lest with this piteous action you convert my stern effects. Then what I have to do will want true color, tears perchance for blood. And then he talks to his mother for a bit, and when she can't see him, she can't see the ghost, he says, why look you there, look how it steals away, my father, in his habit as he lived, look where he goes even now, out of the portal. And since I was reading it in the context of just like, Hamlet is a kid who's sad that his dad is dead, this just struck me as like the saddest thing ever, and I kind of lost it, and my face exploded. So that's Hamlet. It gets 5 stars. Are there people who don't rate Hamlet 5 stars? Why? Then, the next day, a similar thing happened with Maurice by E.M. Forster. Now, unlike Hamlet, I had never read this before. I actually just got it a couple of months ago. So I saw a video, I don't even remember whose. It's not someone I was subscribed to. I sort of randomly came across it about the Page 112 award. I don't know what that's called. But there's some award that is based solely on the quality of books, of the writing on page 112. Just to pick a random page and compare those. And so I thought about this, and I was like, I'll just grab a couple of books off of my shelf and like read the page 112, and see if I can have any thoughts about the books from that. And one of the books I did that with was Maurice. So I read page 112, and then I read page 113, and then I read page 114, and then I was like, I need to read all of this right now. Side note, those pages are very spoilery. I already kind of knew the basic story of Maurice, so I wasn't spoiled, but do not just go in and read page 112 of Maurice. You are definitely putting yourself in danger. I have a lot to say about this book, so I'm going to give it its own video. But just to give you a sense of how amazing it is, I read this book in one evening. I started it too late. I should have started it earlier in the day. I was kind of like, no, Libby, don't start a new book. You're in the middle of 6 books. And then I was like, screw it, man. You just gotta live your life. So I stayed up past midnight, which is way past my bedtime, reading it. And then I couldn't really sleep that night because I was thinking about it so much. I woke up the next morning. I reread some parts of it. I ended up watching the Merchant Ivory film. I've basically been unable to read anything else since this. I'm currently of the opinion, I'm sure this will change eventually, but I'm currently of the opinion, like, why would anyone ever read a book that is not E.M. Forster's Maurice? This book is so good. I'm gonna stop talking about it now. I'll save the rest for a review. So the last thing that I read was just sort of a blip in my Maurice hangover. I read a short story, which you've probably heard of, called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is the second time I've read it. So I decided that it would be a good methadone for the heroine that is Maurice. It's written in the late 1890s. You could call it semi-autobiographical, or you could just call it sort of inspired by some thoughts and experiences that Charlotte Perkins Gilman had when she was dealing with postpartum depression. So it's about a woman who, as you sort of put the pieces together, you learn is dealing with some severe postpartum depression. Her husband is also her doctor. Since this is the 19th century, women's issues and mental health aren't understood very well. So he's basically having her do all of the wrong things, and it's making her worse. She sleeps a lot during the day, which means she sleeps badly at night. Her appetite's getting all thrown off by this. She stays in this room that has this hideous yellow wallpaper, and it starts to drive her insane. She looks at the patterns of the wallpaper, and then she sees like a different pattern like behind the main pattern, and it looks different in the moonlight, and she really starts to lose it. It could be classified as a horror short story, although I don't think Charlotte Perkins Gilman would want it to be classified as such. It's a really satisfying story, both from a suspense angle and from a proto-feminist angle. So yeah, that got 5 stars. I'm gonna go film a review of Maurice. See you guys later.